So I'm going to use a poker game as kind of a metaphor or conceit to try to hash out the nature of the different perspectives through which consciousness can manifest. Which is a fancy way, I guess, of saying all the different perspectives through which we, as conscious beings, can see and experience. And the symbology I like to use is O, G, uppercase I, lowercase I, respectively, for oneness, God, spirit, and then incarnated being. You know, the being you're seeing in this video right now being a lowercase I, in the sense that I identify with this perspective, but I believe channeling all of those different perspectives or lenses simultaneously, O, G, uppercase I, and lowercase I, into the entirety of the I am. Alright, I said this is going to be about poker, right? So, let's say there's a poker game, and it's a heads-up game, one-on-one, and the two people are playing against each other. The only reason the game is able to be played is that the perspectives are exclusive, meaning player one cannot see through player two's eyes what player two's hand is, and player one cannot go into player two's mind and look at player two's strategy and thinking, the thoughts behind why they're doing the bets they're doing, etc. In other words, each player has incomplete knowledge, and the gaps of completeness are specifically in the other player's perspective, right? And so, you know, the reason player one can beat player two is that player two doesn't know all the information that player one knows about the common situation they have, which is the poker table, the chips on it, the cards on it. So if we click out, and this is what's been kind of cool about, you know, the World Series of Poker being televised for what now, like maybe like 30 years, is we get a perspective now as the viewer, which I think is somewhat akin to the perspective from the element of spirit, which is the uppercase I in my little cosmology. So uppercase I is the spirit being that incarnates into life as a lowercase I. And what's kind of wild about that perspective is, you know, down here, lowercase I, those are the two people at the poker table, player one, player two. And the experience of separateness from that perspective is so difficult to bridge, so difficult to transcend or overcome, in part because of this differential, or I don't know if asymmetry is the right word, but, you know, they don't have the same access to the same information. They literally cannot see the game through each other's eyes. That's why they can play it. But from the uppercase I perspective, it's actually there's commonality. There's a co-creation happening. The uppercase I of player one and the uppercase I of player two are co-creating the experience of the poker game. And each uppercase I has the complete information of the other uppercase I. So player one's uppercase I has the same information as player two's uppercase I. They both know what the cards are. They don't just know what the cards are. They've created the cards. They both not only know what the betting strategy or thinking of each player is, they have each equally created it for the other. And this is the part that I think is kind of trippy, maybe almost feels a little invasive. I think the reality is it's actually just overly intimate for a lowercase I, which is that, you know, even if you buy into, okay, yeah, I've got a spirit and it's kind of creating my life, we, as these beings that kind of pride ourselves on a certain degree of privacy and exclusivity, kind of rankle and grind at the notion that everyone else's spirit is both co-creating and co-experiencing our experience to the same degree that we are. We have no private executive control, right? No bridge of the ship where we're the captain, and, you know, okay, maybe everyone else is the crew, and I take their, you know, opinions under advisement, kind of like we do when we're making decisions in life, right? You listen to the people you trust, or maybe just the kind of random information you get, but then eventually a choice is made, and we are the operator, we are the executive, we are the decider. We, the individual I, makes the choice in life. And again, from the perspective of I, lowercase I, it seems that way. But once you get up into the level of spirit, everything is so intermixed, you don't have that anymore. And what's kind of wild, you know, getting back to my poker analogy, is when you're watching poker on television and you can see the cards of each player, you actually get kind of a partial glimpse, at least on the physical level, to what it's like for the spirit watching life. Because again, the spirit doesn't have the same ignorance that the player does. The spirit is co-creating with the other spirit at the table the entirety of the experience, including all the thoughts and awareness that seem exclusive to each individual player. Now, of course, watching on television, what we don't get, and that's, I think, what creates some of the suspense for us, and some of the excitement, is we don't get to actually look into the mind of each player and see what their thinking is. We may know what their cards are, right? Which is kind of a wild experience. But then we don't know what their thinking is. We don't know what their strategizing is. We don't know what they're going to make of it. We don't know if they're deducing what kind of hand the other player has, either the specific cards or the general strength or weakness of the hand relative to theirs. We don't know what they're thinking in terms of betting strategy, how aggressive they want to get, and then even maybe more subtle things, like whether they feel like they're becoming fatigued, so they're feeling a sense of urgency to make a move that's going to be decisive in the game. All those things, a good poker player may actually be able to read in the other, right? And there's an interesting maybe blending of lowercase I and uppercase I, where the good poker player is able to some extent drop the exclusivity of their perspective and allow their consciousness to try to morph with or read onto the other person's, in a sense to try to infer from certain cues or indicators what that person has. In other words, reading their tells, as you might say. Now, if I can indulge a little bit my sense I have on things. So we've talked now about being lowercase I, that's the physical player sitting at the table with your incomplete and exclusive knowledge, seemingly. You've got the uppercase I's, which are the two players at the table, spirits, which are co-creating equally the entirety of the experience for each eye, essentially almost indistinguishably. Then you've got the G above that, which is God. And God is love. And so, this gives me an opportunity to kind of bring out one of my metaphors, which is that the universe is a poker face, and that all cards are love, and that fear whispers bluffing, and that we are play. Because what you can see is that from even those perspectives of the I, they're still creating the game, right? They're still creating that experience of being in a life, being incarnated, and going through things. And in another video, I talk about my theory about why that is, essentially the entangling of kind of knots or crimps or pinches in the spirit being, using life as an opportunity to feel those through and essentially heal them through emotional experiences. But from the perspective of God, God is just basically essentially the parent that is waiting, this is a metaphor, but waiting for the child, or kind of sitting there with the child in support as the child works through their kind of untangling. And God, being love, may look at the poker game and any sense of like seriousness or kind of clinging or gripping that the players have about the poker game with a certain degree, not of amusement, but I can see kind of a smile dawning on the face of God, just saying, saying to the lowercase I's, hey, you both are each creating this experience together, utterly co-creating. There's no distinction between the decisions being made by the spirit of uppercase or player one or player two, and that just seems almost absurd and unbelievable to the lowercase I's. And then it can also look to the uppercase I's, saying you guys are pouring so much of yourselves into this co-creation, putting so much thought and attention into all the details, into the way the king's face look or the jack's face looks, the way the cards feel as you shuffle them, all this intimate detail, all this differentiation. And yet don't you see to some degree how silly that is, because all is God. And what I think is beautiful about this God perspective is there isn't any sense of kind of condescension. That itself would be silly, because God, of course, is creating all of this too. And so for God to condescend would require God to be in ignorance of that fact, that God is not merely just this observing perspective that has, you might call it a wiser or broader view on things, but God is also, on a very granular level, every little fiber of each card in the game. Every little clacking sound that all the chips make is God too. And God knows that, and that's why God's God. and God appreciates it. God presents the silliness of these perspectives. And silliness really meant in a way to soften us, not to mock us or to make us feel bad or to feel weak or foolish or stupid. Really quite the contrary, to get us just to kind of soften our attachments to any senses of seriousness or stiffness we have about what's going on, any senses of importance in the sense of like being special or being more important than anything else. God's just like, you know, you guys are doing your thing, aka I'm doing my thing, and it's beautiful and it's perfect, and hey, if you're feeling a little uptight about it, if you're feeling a little strained, if you feel like you're gripping, just remember the silliness of these things, right? The silliness of these two lowercase i's, which are really two uppercase i's, superimposed on each other and co-creating this experience with all of its sense of separateness. And then likewise, these two uppercase i's really just being a manifestation out of God, which is love, meaning everything is love. And so any, you know, creation of sense experiences of competitiveness, of, you know, one player taking the chips from the other, one player kind of bluffing the other into folding a hand, all of these things, every single bit of it is love. And so the silliness of taking a quote-unquote loss, or a win for that matter, as important or as an indicator of self-worth or of superiority to another is not bad or immoral or wrong from God's perspective. It's just a silliness reflective of an ignorance that God has created for that perspective, so that perspective can carry out its function, which requires the ignorance to function. Otherwise, the poker players wouldn't play their game, right? And the spirits wouldn't engage in their co-creation, right? All for the larger purpose, I believe, of essentially being in oneness, having the experience of spreading out from oneness, and then getting the experience of returning to oneness, all of which is essentially a vibrational frequency experience. But to get the vibrational frequency with enough oscillation and perhaps enough incoherence for us to lose the experience of being in one, which is actually not an experience of all, it's just the all state we always have. But essentially this gives us a bit of a journey or a venture out from it. These oscillations of our waves, which I believe is created through the kind of the imposition of a forgetting or an ignorance on our mind, which then allows us to assume these other, you call them lesser perspectives, but they're really just more limited perspectives, and not limited in a way of a flaw, but limited for a purpose or a function, right? In other words, you could not have the perspective and could not operate from the perspective from total knowledge, because otherwise you'd just be back in one and never be able to venture out. So anyway, I know I got on a little bit of a ramble there, but thought that was an interesting thing about poker and people and spirits and God and the oneness from which all of that is birthed.